Today is Tuesday, September 25th, 2018. My name is Elissa Kaplan. It is my honor and privilege to be interviewing Laure Kaminsky today in her lovely home filled with stories and antiques and her own silversmith work. Good morning. Please tell us your name, and there's a little bit of a story, I think, to your name.
Yes. My real name is Laure, L-A-U-R-E, because I'm born in Strasbourg in Alsace in France. And my grandmother was Laura with an A at the end. And everybody calls me Laura, and I never correct them. But it's not correct. The correct is Laure, and that's the French way.
Do you still speak French?
Yes.
So, when were you born, Laura?
May 21st, 1933, on a beautiful Sunday afternoon.
And you just tell us you were born in...
Strasbourg. That's in Alsace. That's near the Rhine River. It's France. At times in our history it was German. It switched. My father was born in Strasbourg also, but when he was born there in 1893 it was German. And then he became automatically a French citizen after World War II when Alsace became France.
And we'll get more into that in a little bit. You were born into what kind of Jewish community in Strasbourg? Was it a large group of people?
Yes, Strasbourg at that time had a lot of Jews, a big synagogue in a beautiful park, and other synagogues also.
And what did your parents do there? Oh.
Well, my father was a cigarette manufacturer, as was, and cigars and tobacco. And the factory was actually, the offices were in Strasbourg, and the factory that made the cigarettes was on the other side of the Rhine in Germany. And he manufactured cigarettes.
Just right on the other side of, no,
Pretty
the other
close,
side.
let's say 45 minutes away.
Do you know what town that was?
Yes, Laure, L-A-H-R.
Mm-hmm. And what was your father's name?
Ernest.
Ernest. Ernest.
Feist, F-E-I-S-T.
Ernest Feist. And what was your mother's name?
Miriam Strauss, S-T-R-A-U-S-S.
And was she also from Strasbourg?
No, she was from Germany, from Bingen, on the other side of the Rhine.
And how did they meet?
Well, when my mother was young, I have to explain this. My grandfather was a lawyer in Bingen, and he represented the tobacco company as a business. And my mother was the middle of 5 girls,
Wow.
no boys. And my grandfather easily invited people for dinner to their home. In other words, if somebody was a client and it was the right time of day, he brought people home. That was okay with my grandmother, she was used to that. And so my grandfather brought my father sometimes home for dinner. So he knew my mother when she was a little girl because he was 19 years older than my mother.
Wow, that's a lot.
So when they got married, he was 39 and she was 20.
What were your grandparents' names? Do you remember?
Yes, my mother's parents were Helena and Richard Strauss.
And how long had their family lived in Germany?
In Bingen a long time because, well, they're little towns almost like you could say Glenville is part of Greenwich or Stamford. They each lived in a little village right next to Bingen, but call it Bingen.
Okay, and they had been there for more than one generation.
Yes.
Generations they had been there.
Yeah. And
Well,
that's and my father's parents, I'm not sure where my grandfather was born, but my grandmother was born in Germany. And I'll think of the name of the town later. I can't think of it right
And what were their names?
now. Laure
Oh, that's right. You're named after her.
and Joseph. And they must have gotten married I'm not sure, 18-something. And later I'll show you their wedding cups, which say Laura and Joseph,
Oh, wow.
and which are very modern looking. You wouldn't think they're from 18 whatever.
Amazing. Amazing.
I don't have many things from my grandparents because of the war and the Nazis and all that, but I do have their cups.
And did your mother work outside the home?
No, No, because see, that's why I showed you, when we came to the United States in 1941, my sister was a year old. And so my mother had to stay home and take care of the child. My mother was actually a licensed tailor, but she couldn't go to work.
Right, but I bet she made a lot of your clothes.
Sometimes, yeah.
Tell us about those early years in France. What kind of education did you have?
Well, the early years are very complicated. I was born in Strasbourg in 1933 at Hadassah Hospital. When I went back to France some years ago, maybe let's say 20 years ago, it was still a hospital, not Hadassah called anymore, but it was still. So I was born in Strasbourg, and then we lived in Strasbourg for a little while, and then life looked more peaceful, and we moved to an apartment in the factory on the other side, in Laure, where my father made cigarettes. So we moved there for a little while. And then when life didn't look so peaceful, we went back to Strasbourg. And by the time I was, let's say, 8 years old, I had been 4 or 5 different schools because we had to move so often.
What was, in those first few years, what was your Jewish home like?
I would say not very much because there was so many other problems to solve. I mean, we were Jews, and I even remember where the synagogue was in the park near the school where I started. But it wasn't Hitler had pointed to us as Jews, and we had to see how we could survive. So practicing Judaism wasn't the problem.
Right, right. Okay, so you're born in 1933. Tell us about the decision to leave and how all that worked, and your adventure of eventually getting to the United States.
I'll give it to you not too long.
No, take your time.
In 34, 35, we moved first we went to Strasbourg, then we moved to the factory in Laure. Then we moved back to Strasbourg. And then, after a while, and I started school in Strasbourg, let's say kindergarten or first grade, and I was a very unhappy child for many reasons, going to school because I was different than everybody. Now it doesn't stand out. At that time I was very tall, and everybody was very small because French people by and large are shorter. And my French wasn't as pure as the other children's because I spoke French and German, and my mother had a hard time making me kindergarten or first grade, whatever it was, and going into the school because there was another child with similar problems, and that mother I later met, and she and my mother stood outside the school and hoped we would stay in school. And from there then, before that actually, before I started school, my mother and I went to Holland. My grandparents, having lived in Bingen, but my grandfather being politically active in Bingen, was one of the first people who had to move when Hitler came to power. So my grandparents moved to The Hague in Holland. And at that time, people thought The Hague was, Holland was safe because it hadn't been part of World War One. So we went to Holland to visit my grandparents. And since we stayed there a little bit longer, first I got the whooping cough, and I had to stay on the 3rd floor because my grandparents had other children in the house who weren't supposed to get my whooping cough. And then I went to nursery school in The Hague, and I learned some Dutch, which I have no memory of, but I'm told that I did. And then we went back to Strasbourg after that, and then we lived in Strasbourg for 2 or 3 years. But, you know, and then I started school, but we moved a lot because of the political times.
You said that your grandfather was politically active. What does that mean?
He was, well, it was at that time a party system, you know, liberals and liberals and non-liberal, and he was part of the liberal. And for that matter, you asked me about Jewish. My mother did tell me that my grandparents belonged to 2 synagogues in Bingen. Just thought of that. The liberal and the Orthodox. But you just said
Politically active?
active. He was part of the political movement of liberalism in Germany at that time. So he knew he would be one of the first attacked. And later, when we were already in Strasbourg and the Nazis were looking for Jews, they came to the door of my grandparents' house in Bingen, and they knew that they were after my grandfather. So my mother's sisters, who opened the door, talked to the policeman or whoever was at the door while they snuck my grandfather and grandmother out the back door and hid them.
What happened to your grandparents?
Much later, they were killed in Theresienstadt, but that was much later.
So they didn't survive.
And my mother's 2 sisters.
Tell us about the decision to leave and try to get to America. How did that
Now
all
you're
work?
getting into a complicated story. After leaving Strasbourg, with my father's family, my father's sister and husband and so on, we moved to Saumur in the middle of France on the Loire River. And we lived there for a while. Strasbourg was officially transferred when the Germans came to Périgueux. But we did not go to Périgueux. Our family thought they would like to try Saumur, where not everybody was. There were so many people who moved. So we were in Saumur. I went to school in Saumur. That's my father was put in an internment camp in Saumur because of his mixed background between French and German. At that time, they put all people whose papers were more complicated. It was not a concentration camp, it was an internment camp. And my father and his brother and his older son, because he was already 18, was sent to an internment camp in France. And we stayed then in Saumur at the time, and at that time, which was around probably April, May of 1940, my sister was born. It was probably the world's worst time to have a baby. And so it was. And so we were in Saumur. And then I'm skipping around a little bit, going back and forth, I can't help it. As the Germans progressed through the beginning of France and the ligne Maginot, the magical line, was established, they decided that I would go with my aunt and uncle, my father's sister and brother-in-law, and their one son. One son was in the French army. He was a dentist, and he was already around that time, I don't know exactly, captured and was already in a prisoner of war camp in Germany. But the other one had a heart condition, maybe. And anyhow, so he stayed with us. And from Saumur, in Saumur, after my sister was born, my aunt and uncle and Francois, that was the older brother, and his wife, she wasn't his wife yet, decided to go to another part of France that seemed safer. And they decided that, the family decided I would go with them because my mother had the new baby to watch. And so I went with them to southern France. And my mother and my father's brother, who was in the internment camp with my father, his wife and my mother and their 15-year-old son stayed in Saumur a little bit. And then when the Germans continued and people didn't know what would happen, and my sister was a month or 6 weeks old, they took bicycles and tried to stay in what was called Free France. In other words, we're the other side of the Ligne Maginot. And I was up in Mérac in southern France with my aunt and uncle and their son and girlfriend, I guess you'd call it. So that was for a while. Then my father, when the Germans were progressing through France, and the guards at the camp where my father was, at the internment camp, and the guards got worried that they would be in trouble, the guards ran away. So if you have an internment camp without guards, the men could run away. And I have a book where my other cousin wrote about that time, where then they went by foot from where the internment camp was, but thinking we were in Saumur, and came to Saumur by foot, which was a terrible trip. My other cousin wrote a book about this. So when they came to Saumur, and this is how it was, my father was 6'4".
Wow.
And at that time, that was a very unusual thing. So first time they ran away from the internment camp, and they walked to Saumur. I was the one who opened the door when the doorbell rang, and I didn't recognize my father because he had a beard and he was in terrible clothes and so on. So I said, "There's a stranger at the door." They've always kidded me about that. So, but then somehow he was from Saumur. That's why I said it's very complicated. I was in southern France, and my mother, her sister-in-law, my father's brother's wife, and their younger son were in Saumur and went to Périgueux, which was the official place where Strasbourg was transferred to. So they got themselves, I don't know exactly how, to Périgueux with my sister. Oh, I do know how, I'm sorry, that's very important. They left Saumur and got themselves bicycles and put my sister in a spinach bicycle about this big. We still have it. My sister has it. My sister lives in New Haven. And put my sister, who was a few weeks old, into the basket. So my mother, her sister-in-law, and the younger brother bicycled from Saumur to Périgueux. And on the way, of course, they ran out of milk, and they went into a farm and asked a lady if they knew where she could get some milk for the baby. So she said she had a new baby herself. And my mother had originally quite a bit of powdered milk, but thought she was going to run out. I don't know what happened at that farm. But my mother also had I left a few other things out. In Saumur, when my mother was having the baby, the father and mother went to the local hospital to look at it, and they said she can't have the baby there because she had to have a marriage certificate. And my mother was in her 9th month, and from Strasbourg, and my parents were married in Bingen. They had no marriage certificate, so the Catholic hospital said, "Well, you can't have your baby here." So they went to town hall got married,
Wow.
and came back to the hospital so that my mother could have her baby there. And then when my mother, my aunt, and so on left Saumur and went to Périgueux on the bicycles, it was a very difficult time. And my mother still had a gold watch, which she was wearing. And the lady where they went to the farm to get milk also had a new baby. And so my mother and the lady exchanged. My mother gave her the gold watch, and she had papers already for her baby, a birth certificate. So my mother, because they were afraid if somebody would stop them on the road, and they had no papers to show who they were. So that's how they got a birth certificate, a false birth certificate for my sister. When they arrived in Périgueux and took the joint had made arrangements for people, and they got living some kind of, I know the joint was very active in Périgueux and later in Marseille. And they got a little place, but my sister was a small, weak baby. And the sister of my older cousin's wife, but by then they had gotten married. I'm the only one who was present at their marriage. They got married while we were living in Saumur. She was a baby nurse, and she was working in a hospital in Périgueux. And she took my sister, who was now 7 weeks old, something like that, and hid her in the nursery behind the babies, because she was already bigger, being 7 weeks. But there they had food for children, for babies. So she took my sister and hid her behind the newborns, because she was working in the nursery there. And my mother went to visit her there every day, but that's how come she could survive, because there was food for the baby in Périgueux, in that nursery. And so when we were in Périgueux, I started school again. That's why I said I went to so many schools. So in Périgueux, we lived for a little while, and then I'm actually skipping a lot of things, otherwise we'd be here forever. From Périgueux, my father went to Marseille to see if he could get us tickets to come to get out. And my father had a very outgoing, great personality to go with his size and so on, so he was very, very good at getting what he wanted, or tried, you know, he knew how to talk to people and so on. So he went to Marseille to see what he could get, and again, I'm skipping a lot. One of the things which he always told us later was it wasn't good to try to bribe people, because that could backfire. So he gave everybody, like the secretaries in the American embassy and in the consulate and in the French places, all chocolate bars, because nobody could say that was bribery, but yet it made it a little bit personal. And so in Marseille, he got papers for us to come actually to the United States. But he got a ship that went to Martinique, which was a French property. And if you went to Martinique at that time, you didn't need exit papers from France.
This was through the U.S. Embassy, or
No.
in Marseille.
In Marseille,
Was the
we were
French?
we had to get papers to leave France. And probably if I had been a boy, we may not have gotten them. You want to? I'll shut it off. Give it. They didn't want to give exit permits to people with boys, because they were future soldiers, even at 5 years old or something. But my parents had 2 girls, and it didn't matter. And my uncle's 2 sons were born in Germany, so the French weren't so interested in them. So my father was in Marseille trying to get papers for us to leave. And the American consul, the Jewish museum here had quite a show, and I have books about it, about him. He was an awful guy, and he was known later for the American consul. And we had trouble getting papers to leave France. And my father already had a reservation on a boat, the boat that I just showed you the article about. And the consul said to, the assistant consul, said to my father, when you go to the United States, there's a depression. You won't even be able to get a job. How can you support your family? So my father told him, I know how to read maps, and I can always get a job as a taxi driver. And he took that answer. And so we did get papers to leave France. So my sister was in that basket between the trip from Saumur to Périgueux. And that was a really terrible time for us. And then we got on the ship in Marseille and were supposed to go to Martinique. A lot has been written about that time in Marseille because there were many famous people trying to get out of France. So it wasn't just us. Just read about Marc Chagall. He was there too, and Feuchtwanger. There were all kinds of well-known people trying to get on those few ships. And we were lucky and got a ship space. And then
Do you remember anything about the ship itself, what it looked like?
Yeah, because I was 8 on the ship and my sister was 1. So I remember.
Tell us about the ship itself.
Well, it was a ship, I think, supposed to be for 100 people, somebody. The ship was built for, I think, either 12 or 24 passengers, and there were 600. But we had a little room, because most of the people were down in the, whatever you call the bottom of the ship. But we did have a little room. Because of my sister, they gave us, she was a very weak child of 6 months. If you saw her today, you wouldn't think so, but she was. And the English knew that there were lots of Nazis on our ship, in the whole of the ship. So they captured us on the high seas. And at that I remember, at gunpoint. I mean, I specifically remember. And so they did not let us go to Martinique. They took us to Trinidad, which was an English colony at that time. And then we spent 6 or 8 weeks in Trinidad in order everybody had to prove who they were in their papers and all that. And unluckily, I got the whooping cough in Trinidad. No, my sister got the whooping cough in Trinidad, and my mother got sciatica. So I had to take my mother and my sister. Oh, I left a big piece out before, to the hospital there.
What were living
and men and women were completely separated, so my aunt had to take care of me when my mother went to the hospital.
What did Trinidad, it was so different from France. I mean,
It belonged to France. It was a colony.
but what did it look like to a child?
Almost like it did later. My husband and I went specially once to Trinidad to visit people in very colorful clothes. My mother said the terrible was when they got to Trinidad, the most beautiful food was on the, and they couldn't eat it because it was so spicy. So my mother said that was just an experience, that spice, and you can't swallow it. I want to go back to Saumur. And my aunt took, my other aunt, my father's sister, not the one I'll talk about later, when she took me to southern France, and I lived with them in Mérac. And then, after a while, when my father could see that he might get tickets to leave for the United States, there came the problem that they were in Saumur and then in Périgueux, and I was not with my family. So the question was how to retrieve me. So my other aunt, my father's brother's wife, who had been on that bicycle ride with my mother and had older children, took a train, which was a very dangerous thing to do because you were not allowed without proper papers to travel. So she took a train from Saumur, from Périgueux, up to southern France to get me. And you know, today transportation and people know who they are and you make a telephone call, but it wasn't that way. And so we were lucky that they even knew where I was. And so she got on a train dressed as a farmer's wife with a kerchief on her head and an apron and looking very farmerish, and went to retrieve me. If anybody had ever asked her for her papers, she would have been done. It was a very brave thing to do. And so she went up to southern France to get me, came back to Périgueux with me, and explained to me that on the train we weren't allowed to talk because her accent and my accent, from all the background we had, we wouldn't have sounded French. And we didn't want anyone to talk to us or think who we were. So I remember that train ride very well.
What was your aunt's name?
Anna.
Anna.
And so she was a very brave person who went up to retrieve me, bring me to Périgueux, so that when my father got tickets they got 8 tickets, 4 for us and 4 for my uncle, aunt, and their 2 sons. So we had 2 rooms. And if you want to call them rooms, 2 small cabins on that ship. And then I'll go back now to when the ship was halted on the high seas and at gunpoint. That's when they took us to Trinidad instead of Martinique. And that was a very tough time. Then people who were in Trinidad, after a while, they let people say that if you can figure out where you can leave the internment camp in Trinidad. And my parents still had some money sewed into my coat because many people had no more money. And my parents did a little bit. And that's how come we booked a trip on a banana boat from Trinidad to the U.S.
Did you have to have some kind of papers to get into the United States?
Yes, probably the same ones as if we had gone to Martinique. I never heard much about that.
Mm-hmm.
On the wall there is a picture of me with the papers that I left France with, signed by the consulate in Marseille.
So where did you land in the United States?
In New York. My mother's oldest sister was living in New York.
And what was her name?
Ruth.
Ruth.
And she picked us up at the ship and we went to her apartment.
Do you remember much about that
Yes.
boat ride?
Sure.
What was that boat like, the banana boat?
Well, we had enough food and we had enough, that was pleasant because that was easy. That was not the problem.
And the year is now 19...
We came to the United States in June of 1941. And you know, Pearl Harbor was in the fall of 1941, so we were here just 3 months before Pearl Harbor.
So, wow, so
And
we're...
my grandparents is a little bit the story of Anne Frank. They were hidden in Holland, in The Hague, till almost the end of the war. And at the 6 or 8 months before the end of the war, the Germans told the Dutch that if they would point to any Jews hidden anywhere, and my grandparents were hidden in an attic in The Hague with my mother's 2 sisters. and some Dutchman pointed out to them, and they were picked up and taken to the concentration camps.
And you said they went to Theresienstadt?
Yeah. First to another one, and then to Theresienstadt. But none of us know for sure where anybody went at that time. So I'll say Theresienstadt may not be right,
Right.
because the papers from that time are not very... The Germans had papers and so on, and my grandparents are listed in the museum in Israel, and my mother's two sisters.
Wow.
So you didn't come for nothing.
Right, may their memory be for a blessing.
Yeah.
So you're in New York at 8 years old. Did you live in New York City?
Yes. My father had an unusual way of making a living. Being he was actually as I said, a cigarette manufacturer, but his specialty was when you make cigarettes, because it's a live, tobacco is different every year, let's say like peaches. So, if you want to sell your cigarettes, they have to taste the same every year, otherwise you'd lose your customers. So if there's more sun, more rain, more mud, whatever you want, hotter, colder, you have to keep changing the mixture of the cigarette. And cigarettes at that time, I don't know how it is now, were made of, let's say, 8 different kinds of tobacco from the whole world. So you had to keep changing the mix so that the product would taste the same. My father was an expert at that, and he was known for that. Already in Germany, that was the base of cigarette manufacturing.
What was the name of his cigarette?
Rothhandler, R-O-T-H. I have packages here, I can show them to you. H-A-E-N-D-L-E. And so he had a profession, I'll call it, I don't know what else, which was very specialized. So my father, after we were here for 6 weeks, had a job, because the American cigarette manufacturers, when he applied, knew who he was. And that didn't make us rich, but it made us get a job.
So what part of New York did you live in?
First we lived in the Bronx with my mother's sister, just for 6 weeks. And then we lived on 72nd Street between Broadway and Amsterdam in a residential hotel. I went to Catholic school there for a year, because my sister was so small, and the public school would have been across Broadway and some more streets. My mother couldn't take me and pick me up because she had a baby at home. And right next to the hotel where we were, Hotel Hargrave, was a Catholic school. So they sent me to Catholic school for a year, and they were very nice to me. Some of the kids didn't like it because I didn't have to go to catechism. But the nuns were very nice to me. And then we moved to Riverside Drive in 84th Street, and I could go to public school.
And so you, were you able to get any of your other relatives out of Europe?
No, it was too late, because we were the last ship out of Marseille, so there was no more, there's no people who came out of Marseille after us. Some people did walk to Spain, and some ships later, not much later, went through Spain, but not out of Marseille.
Well, okay, so you're in elementary school in New York. Tell us about the rest of your education there.
Well, I went to PS9 on 82nd Street and West End Avenue. Yeah. And there were a couple of other children in the class who were immigrants. And I made friends with people. Here, it wasn't so difficult not to speak. I spoke English pretty fast. I understand that it's easier for some people to learn a language, and I was small, young. And it wasn't, and even later, I had an incident about that. When I was at Teachers College in Columbia University, you had to take a speech test. Everybody did before you'd be finished to become a teacher. And I took the speech test and I passed, no problem. And stupid as I was, when it was all over and signed up and most people had failed the test, I said to the professors who were the judges of whether your English was good enough to be a teacher or whether you had to take some more classes in English, I asked them, "You didn't hear an accent?" I said, "No." I said, "Okay." They said, "Why, do you have an accent?" I said, "No." They said, "Was English your first language?" "No." And they were very annoyed that they did not hear it. They felt attacked. So obviously I didn't have an accent.
Well, so you went to Teachers College.
I went first to NYU and got a bachelor's degree, and then I went to Teachers College at Columbia.
And what were you ready to teach?
Elementary school, which I only did for a year or two.
So, did you have any other Jewish education once you got to the United States?
First thing my parents did when we came to the United States, we joined a synagogue, Congregation Habonim. And partly we joined because we wanted, my parents were very conscious Jews, not very observant, but very conscious Jews. And my aunt and uncle, the ones where we lived with them first, my mother's sister, they had a son who was 12. And so they had already joined a synagogue to get ready for his bar mitzvah, so we joined the same synagogue right away because of Ernie's bar mitzvah. So we were in Congregation Habonim probably in 1942. At that time, the Central Synagogue, where now this year on TV they showed the services at Central Synagogue. Central Synagogue was very nice to us as German Jews. We were considered German Jews because they mixed German and French very much at that time. And Central Synagogue was Reform and said that we could use their basement as our meeting place. And they were very nice, because at that time the Reform movement was not so strong yet. And they were much more open to helping refugees, because my parents and their friends and acquaintances and also were more, let's say, conservative Jews, if you would classify them. But the conservative movement was very strong at that time. And they said that if we were a synagogue, we had to pay so much per member to be part of the conservative union. And the Reform said they would take the refugees free. So we became a Reform synagogue.
Did you have a confirmation ceremony?
Yes, I had a confirmation, which is equal now to girls' bat mitzvahs. And I gave a speech about Spinoza.
Oh my.
We had a very good rabbi, Han, H-A-H-N, and he really was he was not the teacher on the everyday class, but for the confirmation class he was, and it was on Shavuot, and there were 6 of us. Only 2 are alive, me and one other one she lives in San Francisco.
Did you wear a long white dress?
No, we wore just pretty dresses.
Flowers and...
Yeah, whatever.
And got dressed up. So this was at now we're in what year was that? 50 something?
I wrote it down before you came. I wrote a few notes.
We're in the 50s though.
Yeah,
early 50s.
47.
47.
My confirmation was in 47.
So,
I think I still have the slip they gave us.
I bet there's a picture of you on a synagogue wall somewhere.
Could be, but Habonim is now a very active, but now they are conservative. Since 2-3 years they've joined the conservative movement. But now the synagogue moved everywhere, and then finally they bought a building on 66th Street between Central Park and Columbus. And lately that building was ripped down and they put up a big apartment house and gave Habonim somehow a way to continue having a synagogue. I haven't been to the new place.
So tell us about getting married and starting a family.
Yeah, I went, I guess, after we were in Hotel Hargrave in that residential hotel on 72nd Street. We moved to an apartment on 84th Street in Riverside Drive. And unusually, I have a niece who's a real estate agent, and she told us the other day it's one of the few buildings that's still a rental in Manhattan, in that neighborhood. Everything else are.
It's next door to my daughter.
Huh?
It's next door to my daughter.
Yes, we
And I
told.
used to stay there when I was in college.
Mhm. And we lived there, and what you asked me? Oh.
How did you
Yeah,
meet your husband?
I've been at a B'nai B'rith party when I was 16 or 17.
So you were part of B'nai B'rith,
Yeah.
and he was.
Well, I wasn't really part of B'nai B'rith. We went to a party that they had, and he was there with some of his friends, and that's where I met him. And I got married to him when I was 21, but there was a year in there when we didn't date. We took on and off, because I really wasn't ready for anything. I wanted to date and have a life.
What did you like about him?
He was fun.
And when
I was always, in my own opinion, too serious. Because of my background, it weighed on me. And so he was fun, and he was lighter,
was he an American?
an American Jew. And his mother told him not to marry a greenhorn. And he said, that's just what I like about her. But he said that a few times to her, because she did not approve of me. She didn't feel comfortable. She was an American Jew who had no idea about refugees, knew about her family, and this was a strange girl, not born in New York, not born in Washington Heights, not born in Brooklyn. She was not open to somebody who wasn't what she knew about. And so she would have loved to get rid of me, but it didn't work.
So your husband's name?
Saul, his first name was Saul, his second name was Stuart, Stuart, and he always called himself Stuart, but his name was Saul.
And tell us about your wedding.
Our wedding was very nice. The ceremony was in in 1950-51. My parents moved from that apartment in Manhattan to White Plains. One of the reasons was because there was talk of war at that time. And my parents felt that if they bought a house in White Plains, not a fancy house, but a bigger house, then if relatives had to get out of Manhattan, there would be room for all of us.
And based on your war experience.
So my parents bought a house in 1950, in the winter of 50-51 in White Plains. And I had just finished high school at that time. I graduated in the middle of the year. I only went to high school 3.5 years, I was done. So we moved in 50-51 to White Plains. And my wedding was in 1954 in my parents' house,
Oh.
December of 1954.
And was
And
it?
we have 2 daughters.
And what are their names?
Michelle is the older one, she lives in Providence. And the younger one is Andre, and she lives here in Stamford, which is why I'm living in Stamford now, because she wanted me to live close to her when she thought it was time to sell my house in Greenwich. And so I made life simpler. So
So how did you get from White Plains to Greenwich?
well, when my husband and I got married, we had a little apartment in New Rochelle for a while. And my older daughter was born in New Rochelle, at White Plains Hospital, but we were living in New Rochelle. And then we bought a house in Rye, and we were 14 years in a house in Rye, right near Playland. And then we moved to Greenwich, right off King Street, Sherwood Avenue. And then I moved here a year and a half ago.
What did you and your husband do for your?
My husband was first for a long time a car dealer, and then he was he was always very interested in photography. And then when the Russian Jews came, and my husband was already more than a little bit in the camera business, the Russian Jews weren't allowed to take money out of Russia for quite a while when they came to the United States. And so they often brought Russian cameras with them because they were told that those they could sell here. And so in his camera business, he started to buy Russian cameras from the Russian Jews to help them out. And after a while, when he had like 30 of them, he decided he'd better look into how to sell Russian cameras. So we became specialized in Russian cameras. So we sold and serviced Russian cameras. And they're not 35 millimeter. Yeah, a normal camera is 35 millimeter. And the Russian cameras were competition to, the finest medium format cameras come from, at that time, from Sweden, Norway, called Hasselblads. And these were competition to Hasselblads, only the lenses were either as good or better because Russian labor is so cheap, so they could make very good lenses. But the cameras were not finished well, the leather and the mechanics and so on. So people who couldn't afford a Hasselblad bought a Kiev. They were called Kiev cameras because they were made in Kiev, near Kiev. And so he had a Russian camera business.
And what did you do?
At first, I taught for a few years, but that didn't work out well for me because at Columbia University, it was very modern, call it very progressive. And I was in a school in New Rochelle where the teacher and the principal was from 1800. So when they went in my classroom, they didn't like that I wasn't exactly teaching what you were supposed to be teaching at 1022, because something that was up. So I was not a happy teacher. And I had originally, now this gets a little different. Originally, when I graduated in NYU, I went to the School of Business. And I really wanted to become a social worker, because that's really what I am, what my nature is. But my father, somebody said to me whether I took that badly from him. Not at all. Not in a mean way, and not in a, his personality let you understand what he was saying. He was making a good living, but he didn't know, this is very old-fashioned, if he could support me to become a social worker, and he felt that I would need a PhD to be really a good psychologist, social worker. And he didn't know if he could afford to keep me in school that long. So he encouraged me to become a teacher and go to Columbia Teachers College, where I could much faster, where he knew he could pay for. He didn't believe that people who were middle class or upper middle class, whatever, he was making a good living. He didn't believe in scholarships at all. He thought that was for quotation mark poor people, and one shouldn't take away money from those who should get scholarships, for those where the parents could support them. And that was very ideological for him. And so he didn't want me to study something where I would be nothing till I got that PhD, and he didn't know if he could afford, because I had a younger sister, and he knew that he had to start, her education, and he was worried about that. So he sort of encouraged me. I was already married, but 21, but 22. He didn't want me to do what I really wanted to become, and I understood that. And so I first worked with secretarial things more in marketing, like I had graduated from NYU, and then I went to Teachers College, and then I had the bad experience teaching. And by that time, my father was very active in a large cigarette manufacturing company in Germany who had really bought my father's cigarette company, but left it independent. And so this gets again complicated. So I got a job with them, with the German Tobacco Company, but living here. Because at that time, interest on money was much cheaper here than in Germany. So they bought tobacco. German cigarettes are mostly made of American tobacco. And they bought the American tobacco here, left the warehouse, left the tobacco here till they needed it, because then they could finance it with lower interest rates, because you're talking about big numbers. And then we only shipped it to Germany when they were ready to manufacture the cigarettes.
Hey, we had the global economy even then.
And so I was in charge of keeping the receipts and the warehousing. I had a job for 20 years or something, being in charge of warehousing the the receipts, which were pieces of paper, and the tobacco was in North Carolina. And then they would write me and say, we want, I don't know, 100 bales or whatever, and then we would ship it. And I did that shipping for 20 years, which was very good because my children were growing up and I could make my own hours. They didn't care when I shipped and so I had that as a job for a long time.
I just wanted to ask you about your father's camera store. Where was that located?
On Delavan Mill Street, in Portchester. Well, my father never, my husband.
Your husband, I'm sorry, where were
It's
you?
okay. My husband, first he was in the car business for a long time, and then he switched to the camera business. And then he had a store on Mill Street / Delavan Avenue in Portchester.
And where was the car dealership?
We had for a while, we first had one in Rye, and then we switched to the Bronx.
Oh, so you're okay. And what kind of cars?
Well, at first we had foreign cars. We had a dealership for Fiat and Citroen and so on. And later he was more in used cars.
So, oh my. How did you get interested in silver? Now tell us about your silversmithing.
Well, I always admired, called it art, but not painting. And my husband and I really enjoyed that. He was much more creative as a designer than me. So we would work together on projects of designing things and making them, but as a hobby, never as a business. And that's my Seder plate. But there are a lot of things here that I've made, and this Wednesday I'm starting again. Because having moved this year and a half where I was moving, I really didn't do any silver work because it was just too difficult for me to get started again. But now I'm all set. I have a workshop in Thornwood where I have my tools, and I'm going back to the 92nd Street Y on Wednesdays to take a class. There was a guy teaching at the 92nd Street Y. Originally that workshop was started at the Jewish Museum in the basement. And when the Jewish Museum grew very fast and had space problems, they made an agreement with the 92nd Street Y to move the whole silver repair shop and designing, which had been in the basement, to the 92nd Street Y. So that's how they got into the silversmithing business, to work with the Jewish Museum. And I guess, maybe there's one or two others, but the most known and most gifted silversmith and repair person in the last many years has been Bernstein. And he retired last year, and I took his classes for 15 years. And so now all the people who were in his class had to rethink, what do I do now? And that's why, but it worked also with my moving. I really didn't have my head on it. So now I'm starting on Wednesday again with a different teacher.
Well, you have on one of your lovely pins.
Oh, yeah.
And
I have all kinds of things.
candlesticks.
Yeah, I have candles in that, and over here, I have menorahs. I've made a lot of menorahs. I like making menorahs. There's over there too. In that corner, there's a menorah. Here.
So we'll get some pictures of those. Have you, in addition to all of the other things, have you gotten involved in any other community affairs?
Yes.
Tell us about that. You're a busy lady.
Yes. They make fun of me that I mean, not now, but I still have a lot of energy. Am very active. Now I'm not very. I was very active in a congregation in White Plains, the Bet-Am Shalom.
Just there for high holidays.
You were at Bet-Am? Our tent, our beautiful tent.
Okay. Wow. So you were very active at
Very
Bet-Am.
active. I was president. I'm the only person who was president of Bet-Am for 3 years.
Okay.
Most people are for 2 years, and it was a long time ago, and you'll see it on the wall there, the sign about it. I was for 2 years, and then we had a political problem, within people. And so they said, you better stay another year, otherwise we're in trouble. So I was for 3 years president of Bet-Am Shalom. And I've had every job you can have at Bet-Am Shalom. And I was there for the high holidays, except for Rosh Hashanah, where I was at a mutual friend of Louise's and mine. She was one of the original starters of Bet-Am Shalom. She became a rabbi. And then she had a congregation here in Stamford, Emily Korsnick.
Right. Rabbi Emily, right.
And I was at Emily's house for Rosh Hashanah, so I spent Rosh Hashanah at Emily's house where she had services now, and Yom Kippur at Bet-Am Shalom, because she decided not to have Yom Kippur at her house. But I'm still active at Bet-Am Shalom. I was there Shabbat morning this week. I go very often. And I know all the people who are still alive. I don't know the younger people who've joined, but it's a very active synagogue, as you saw.
But that's Reconstructionist, isn't it?
Now, I've done other things. I've been a Girl Scout leader, done all kinds of things.
Tell us about your children and grandchildren.
I have 2 daughters. My older daughter is a musician. There's music in my husband's family everywhere you look. And my 2 daughters have those gifts of being very musically gifted.
And what's her instrument?
The violin, but it's mostly as folk music, and she's educated as a classical musician, violin, but she teaches more string and folk music and all kinds of, not class. She will teach classical, but most of her students are not. And she lives in Providence. She teaches in daycare centers, Head Start, and then private lessons in the afternoon.
Does she have a family?
No. She has a very nice husband, who's also a musician and has a furniture repair shop in Providence.
They are full service. What's
Yes.
his name?
Alan Bradbury.
And
But
what,
Michelle is Michelle Kaminsky.
keeping that. What about your other daughter?
She's also very gifted in music, and she played the cello for many years, but decided at a point where she had to that she didn't want to become a professional cellist. She was offered possibilities, but she decided that's not what she wanted. So ultimately she represents musicians for commercials, because you see, you have to have a very good ear. So if you hear somebody sing, you have to know how to place them in a job, where they would fit, where they're looking for that kind of person. And that's really her specialty.
And she lives in,
She lives here on Weed Avenue,
oh, you said she was here.
Weed
yeah.
Circle.
And does she have a family?
Yes, she has one son,
And what's his name?
Eli,
So,
and he's working in commercial company. He's 24 and has a good job. He's happy.
And perhaps can drive his grandmother around.
Yeah, no, I'm still driving and I hope to continue.
There you go, there you go.
No, I drive all over. I was in New Haven the day before yet. I'm going to New Haven tomorrow.
Talk about your work with the Israelis.
Oh, yes.
Oh.
That's why you asked me what I do. I'm the head of an organization which we started 30 years ago, inviting Israel. At that time, we invited Israeli soldiers who were disabled. You had them in Stanford also, but our program out of White Plains, and it was started because Rabbi Emily saw it here in Stanford, and thought she could do it in Westchester, and so I've been with her since the first year. And what we've done is for 20 years we did men. And then we had some problems with the organization that sent the Israeli men here. And we decided to do women. Because women get a lot less attention. And I mean, there are a lot less women who are in the army, but there's still a lot of women. And even if they're not in the front and they're a little bit in the back, first of all, they get disabled sometimes, and we've had, but they also have to take care of the family when the husband, disabled or not, goes to war. So they're very important and suffer a lot. So we decided that women don't get enough attention. And so 12 years ago, we switched from men to women. And we had the luck, I knew a lady who was my friend through somebody, who was just retiring. She was, and she's still active without exactly. She was the head of all social services in Israel. So she knew where all the agencies were in each town and village that did social service. So when she heard from me that we had so much trouble with the Beit Elohim, that was the veterans organization, she said to me, and we were ready to quit, because we weren't going to work with them. They were sending us their nephews and their uncles, and it wasn't what we wanted. And so she said, since she was semi-retiring from her job as head of the Department of Social Services, she would take it on as a volunteer, because she knew where by her job, she knew where all the agencies all over Israel were who worked with people who needed help. And so she said she would take it on to choose who would come to us, and she's still doing it. And we're still working with the women.
Women only? What
Now,
is the name of your organization?
Shalom Yisrael.
Easy
And
enough.
we wanted, and I'll try and say it in a positive way, we wanted to continue helping people who otherwise wouldn't get a chance. I know that Stanford, for instance, now takes high people in the Army, and so on, in the services, and has them come here and speak to people and mix with families. But they are already high officials. And we wanted to stay with individuals who needed the help. And so we used private homes, and one family recommends the next. We never advertise, because we wouldn't know who would come and say, I'll take somebody. That's one of our policies that we try to stick to, that we only use homes where somebody says that would be a good place. Because we're concerned about placing an Israeli woman in a home where we don't know much about the home. And Elissa sends us mostly people who need a change very badly. We've done now 3 years right on the border where all the missiles have been falling. And this year we did northern Israel just when there was all the trouble with Lebanon and Syria. It was coincidence that we would just had 8 women. We changed it from 10 to 8, mainly for practical reasons. We had 8 women. We had 2 Bedouin women. They stayed, by the way, with Rabbi Emily, the two Bedouin women. She likes better to have two than one because they take care of each other.
And when did they come? What time of year?
The last week of April and the first week of May. And we take them to New York City the first week, and the second week we take them to Washington, D.C., where we rent a bus, a small bus, and we take them. And we get either people who are, some years they'll send us a bunch of social workers, and you know, if the social workers get 2 weeks of rest and recreation, you really help everybody because they have an influence within the community. Sometimes Aliyah sends us other people. I mean, this year we had a very big mix of people where she felt they were, through the agency, she doesn't really pick the individuals. She meets with every individual and interviews them, but she doesn't originally say, it's you. She asks the director of the social service agency to suggest people to her whom they think would be either the most needy or their influence into the community of having rest and recreation would be the advantage.
And are they a certain age, or could they be?
They're between 21 and 65. It just depends on, and some are married, some have children, some don't. But and then we find people in Westchester who house the guest, and we keep them busy every day. So if the guest says both of us go to work and we're not home, that's fine, because we meet at Westchester Reform Temple in the morning at 8 o'clock. They have to drop them off, and then they can pick them up at 5 or 6, and we also arrange for carpools, not a problem.
And do you have a public forum where the people of Westchester meet the Israeli women?
No, now we do a little bit. For many years, they didn't want it because we were afraid of people coming and seeing Israelis, and we were afraid about the security, I'll put it that way. So we don't advertise at all, but we were also just very careful about not even saying too much, because you never know. Now we have felt safer, and we do, but we don't, and then we don't want the guests, that's another big thing that's different than Stanford and us. Now, if somebody wants to, and if it's arranged, we'll let one of our guests talk to a group. But that's only since a year or two. We don't want any pressure. We want them to have rest and relaxation. We're trying to service them, not, I mean, the Americans, we're happy to have them, meet them, and we have dinners and coffee hours, but we don't want pressure on them to have to speak, or some of them come very shy, and we don't ask them to, we tell them, if you want to talk to people, you can, but if you want to just be with your friend or be with your host family, we want it to be rest and recreation, not a pressure. And so now, it hasn't really happened, but we don't we haven't encouraged them, let's say, to go and speak to Hadassah or some other group, because we really philosophically are trying to do rest and recreation. And they need it badly. Some of them say they don't want to, they'll call their family and find out how they are, but they don't want to know where a bomb fell, or, you know, they're so absorbed every day in Israel just staying alive that being here for 2 weeks, they want to unwind.
What an amazing organization.
Yes,
and
Emily
you
and I,
have
and we
created.
have wonderful volunteers, because people drive them every day to New York. We have room for everyone, men, women, children. When we have a dinner party, the kids like to serve. The women and the men drive them to New York and take them shopping. We always ask them before, what do you want to see? What do you want to do when you come to the United States? We can't always do everything they ask, because, you know, also they ask sometimes for things which they haven't been to the United States, so they don't know what to ask for. But we work it out.
So the Grand Canyon is not part of your tour, right?
It's too expensive, we'd love to do it, but there's enough around here. I mean, there's even, Emily thinks we should be next year, maybe one day more in Washington, and some of us think we have enough in New York, because in Washington we have to pay for the hotel. So usually we leave Monday morning very early and come back Wednesday night from Washington. And right now we're thinking whether we should do another day in Washington, because they all love Washington, but then we miss a day in New York. So, and they all love, not all, I mean, some groups like museums, some groups like parks, nature. So, you know, one goes against the other and we try to balance it. We do always keep the group together. We don't say 4 of you can go to the park and 4 of you can go do something else.
That's it. What a great idea. I'd like to ask you a whimsical question.
Yes.
As it's been a pretty serious interview. You've lived on several continents and traveled, I imagine, and as well. And what's the most amazing invention you've lived to see?
Well, I'm very upset about our political situation in the United States. Not an invention, but I didn't think that they would come. You know, when they talk about refugees and settlement and tearing families apart, it hits home too much.
It's starting to sound familiar. Well, let's hope that no one will relive that past. What advice do you have for future generations?
Well, I guess in a way I would say that if I didn't have a extended family who put themselves out in different ways and at different times, that's been very important. And we are still a very close family. My sister, my brother-in-law. And I think that I mean, not everybody has the opportunity, but sometimes then you make friends who are like family. And I think, I don't think, if my family hadn't extended themselves at different times to me when I was young, I don't know what would have happened to me. So I'm very aware of that.
Beautiful advice. Is there anything else you'd like to tell us about your life?
There's probably so much more. I mean, I've had I don't consider it complicated because I've been lucky in many things. But you know, so much has happened in my lifetime.
And it sounds like more is going to be happening in the future, more good things.
I hope so.
Thank you so much, Laure Kaminsky, for a beautiful interview.
Grade at PS9 in New York. It was very modern, and we had to do a project. We had to write a book. It could be a novel, it could be a history, it could be a bunch of poems, but it had to be art, had to be writing the book yourself, physically, doing the research of what you wanted either write or you could do a painting, but it was a whole project. And so I have the book that I wrote in 8th grade about my life, the way I saw it then.
What's the name of it? What did you?
Laura. And I'll show it to you.
Fabulous.